The voice on the other end of the channel was calm. Too calm. That is what I remember most. Not the words themselves, but how Primus Vale delivered them. The way you might tell someone their application for a job had been denied. Polite. Practiced. Utterly without concern. Earth has been assessed, he said. The civilizational index places your species at Class 2 dependent tier. Your file has been logged accordingly. I was standing at the delegates' podium in the grand chamber of the Galactic Council. 17 species watched me from elevated arcs of seats that curved in a full circle around the central floor. The chamber was built to make you feel small. It worked. The ceiling was so far above that the upper gallery disappeared into a soft blue haze. The floor beneath my feet was a single polished slab of dark stone veined with silver light. Every sound I made, even the soft shift of my weight, echoed faintly off the walls. I am Kale Morrow. I am 41 years old. I served 12 years in the undiplomatic corps, 6 of those in conflict mediation, 2 managing first contact preparation protocols, back when first contact was still a theory rather than a calendar entry. I have sat across tables from people who wanted to end nations. I know what pressure feels like. But nothing I had ever done prepared me for this room. The chamber gallery held representatives from species that had been spacefaring for centuries before our oldest civilizations learned to write. The Threx, tall, copper-skinned, with 4 upper limbs folded neatly across their chests, sat to the left of the Primus platform. The Velhari occupied the far right arc, their translucent membrane wings pressed flat against their backs in a posture I had been told meant polite disengagement. The Morkai sat in the second row, entirely still, their dark eyes catching the ambient light of the chamber and reflecting it back in faint violet pulses. Every single one of them was watching me. Most of them were not impressed. The Primus himself stood on a raised platform at the head of the chamber. Vale was a member of the founding species, the Ethrin, who looked, to a human eye, almost like tall people made of pale blue stone. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if every gesture had been weighed before being made. Vale had been running the Galactic Council for over 200 years. He was not cruel. He was, I think, simply honest about what he believed. That the galaxy had an order, and that order made sense, and that anything below a certain threshold of civilizational development was simply a variable to be managed rather than a voice to be heard. Your species, Vale continued, reading from the index report projected at the center of the chamber for all to see, has achieved interplanetary travel but not interstellar unity. Your military assets are fragmented across multiple independent national entities with no unified command structure. Your internal conflict rate over the past 3,000 years places you in the highest tier of self-directed aggression among all cataloged species. There was a sound from the gallery. I recognized it after a moment. Some of the species were laughing, not in a cruel way, or rather, not in a way they considered cruel. It was the laugh of people watching something awkward happen to someone who probably should have known better than to try. I kept my expression steady. I had trained for this. I had practiced in front of mirrors, in front of panels, in front of people whose job was to say hard things to my face until I stopped flinching. As a Class 2 dependent, Vale said, Earth will be placed under Council stewardship. This is a protective designation. It ensures. I understand the designation, I said. The room went quiet, not because my voice was loud, it was not. It was because I had interrupted the Primus. Apparently that was not done. Vale paused. He looked at me the way you look at a household appliance that has suddenly started speaking. Ambassador Morrow, he said, the index assessment is not a negotiation. It is a measurement. I understand, I said again. I simply wanted to confirm that I had heard it correctly. Vale nodded slowly. Very well, the assessment stands. We will proceed to the stewardship framework discussion in. Before we do, I said, I have a question, a single one. I am told that council protocol allows a delegate to pose one formal question before a framework discussion is opened. There was a pause. Vale looked toward his protocol officer, a small, quick-moving creature I had never gotten a clear name for, who gave a single nod. "You may ask," Vale said. I looked at him. I looked at the gallery. I looked at the Threx delegate, whose name was Davin Rel, who was watching me with the expression of someone waiting for a punchline. I thought about a message I had received 3 hours before this session began. It had come through an encrypted channel reserved for the highest tier of undefense communications. It was 7 words long. "Package is ready. Your call, Ambassador." I thought about Admiral Yena Torres, who had sent that message, and who was currently somewhere I was not allowed to confirm publicly, commanding assets that the Galactic Council had no record of. I thought about how we had gotten to this room in the first place, the years of preparation, the quiet work, the long patience of a species that had survived things that would have ended any civilization the Council had ever catalogued. Then I asked my question. "Has the Council," I said, "ever run the civilizational index on a species after that species decided it had nothing left to lose?" The gallery was silent. Vale tilted his head slowly. It was, I had learned, an etherian gesture that meant something between confusion and consideration. "That scenario," he said, "is not part of the index parameters." "I know," I said, "that is my point." I let the silence sit in the room for exactly 3 seconds. Then I smiled, not a large smile, just a small one, and I said, "Please continue with the framework discussion." Vale looked at me for a long moment. Then he continued. But something had changed in the room. I could feel it. Some of the delegates in the gallery had stopped looking at me the way you look at something to be managed. They had started looking at me the way you look at something you are not entirely sure about. I filed that away. I would need it later. In my jacket pocket, my communicator rested against my ribs, warm from body heat. I had not touched it yet. I had not needed to. But I would very soon. And when I did, the Galactic Council was going to hear something it had never heard in its 400-year history. The sound of a species that had spent centuries being underestimated, and had spent every one of those centuries preparing for exactly this moment. The framework document was 37 pages. I know because I counted. The Threx delegate, Davin Rel, slid it across the table with a gesture so practiced and smooth that it was clearly something he had done many times before. The cover was printed in 12 languages, 12 being, apparently, the minimum required for galactic legal documentation. English was not among them. There was a translated summary at the back, 2 pages. I read it without letting my expression change. The summary said, Earth would retain nominal sovereignty over its home planet and its 2 closest colonial bodies. It would surrender mineral and resource rights to 4 of its 8 colonized worlds. All military assets above a certain tonnage threshold would be transferred to Council Fleet Command for integration into the unified defense apparatus. In exchange, Earth would receive Council protection, trade access, and the right to submit non-binding advisory opinions on matters that specifically concerned human populations. Non-binding advisory opinions. I read that twice. Then I set the document flat on the table and folded my hands on top of it. We were in the Council's private deliberation annex, which was smaller and quieter than the Grand Chamber. The ceiling here was lower. The lights were warmer. It felt more like a conference room than a throne hall, which I suspected was the point. The Grand Chamber was for performance. This room was for finality. Beside Davin Rel sat 2 of his aides and a council legal officer whose species I did not recognize but who had the particular stillness of someone trained to observe and record. On my side of the table, I was alone. The council had offered me an aide. I had declined. "The framework is generous," Rel said. His voice, filtered through the translation unit embedded in my ear, came through as smooth and unhurried. Most dependent designates do not retain nominal sovereignty at all during the initial stewardship period. I appreciate that, I said. The resource transfer is also phased, he said. You have 18 months before the first planetary assessment team arrives. Also appreciated, I said. Rel leaned back slightly. He was not a cruel person either, I thought. He was a functionary. He believed in the system he worked inside the way most people believe in the weather, not as something to be argued with, just something to be navigated. Ambassador Morrow, he said, and his tone shifted just enough to let me know this was the part he considered important. Earth is not the first species to receive a dependent designation. Many of our strongest current member species began in this tier. The stewardship framework is not a punishment. It is a pathway. A pathway, I said. Toward full integration, toward standing, toward being heard. I looked at the document under my hands, toward non-binding advisory opinions. Rel paused. The advisory framework expands as. Davin, I said. I had not used his given name before. It made him stop. How many species are currently in the Class 2 dependent tier? He glanced at his aide, 14. And how many have advanced to full council, standing in the past century? A shorter pause this time. The review process is. How many, I said. He folded his upper limbs, 2. 2 out of 14, I said, over 100 years. The process is rigorous, he said. It is meant to ensure stability. I nodded slowly. I have a question for you, a personal one, not a formal one. I paused to let him decide whether to allow it. He gave a small nod. Have you ever studied human military history? He blinked, a rapid multi-lid closure that his species used for mild surprise. The index covers your conflict rate and technological. Not the index, I said. I mean the actual history, the campaigns, the turning points, the moments where everything seemed finished for one side and then something unexpected happened. Rel looked at me steadily. I am not a military historian. No, I said, you are not. I let that sit. Then I said, we have a saying. It is very old. It goes, the danger is not in the enemy you can see. The danger is in the one who has stopped caring what you think of them. The room was quiet. The legal officer's recording device made no sound, but I could see the small amber indicator light pulsing on its side. In my ear, a voice that was not Rel said something. It was very quiet, a low carrier frequency buried under the translation channel, something only I could hear. The voice belonged to Admiral Yena Torres. Kale, she said, fleets are in position, stealth holding. All 3 wings confirmed ready. Velori ground teams report liberation of the outer settlements is complete. Broadcast signal standing by. Your call. 18 months of preparation. 342 ships. 49 special operations teams embedded across 9 council-adjacent systems. A cyber warfare division that had spent the last year quietly mapping every data pathway in the Council's defense network. Alliances quietly built with species in exactly the kind of situation Earth was now being asked to accept. All of it waiting, all of it ready, all of it hinging on what I decided in this room. Rel pushed the document slightly closer to me. Ambassador, the session window is limited. We would like to proceed to the signing stage. I looked at the document. I looked at Rel. I thought about the 14 species sitting in dependent tiers, sending non-binding advisory opinions into a void, waiting 100 years for a review that almost never came. I thought about what we had quietly done for them, while the Council was busy cataloging Earth as weak. Davin, I said, I want to ask you one more thing, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. He waited. When the Council ran the index on Earth, I said, what did you classify our internal conflict history as? He did not hesitate. A primary indicator of civilizational instability. Species with high internal conflict rates are statistically less likely to maintain cohesive interstellar. We survived every single one, I said. He stopped. Every war, I said. Every collapse, every famine and every plague, and every time someone was certain it was over, we survived it. And every time we survived, we learned something. And every time we learned something, we built something harder to break than the thing that was broken before. I stood up from the table. You looked at our scars and called them weakness. You never stopped to consider that something has to survive a great deal in order to have that many scars. I picked up the document. I set it back down on his side of the table without my signature on it. I have an alternative proposal, I said. Rel stared at me. Ambassador. I touched my communicator. 2 words. Show them. The lights in the annex flickered. Not much. Just for a moment. But every screen in the room, the legal officer's device, the display panel on the wall, the small ambient readout embedded in the table's surface, all shifted at once. The wall panel came to full brightness. It was showing a live external feed from the station's observation array. The space around the station was, for the first time in the Council's recorded history, not empty. 342 ships sat in a perfect sphere, not moving, not targeting, just there, patient, waiting. Rel stood up slowly. The legal officer dropped something. Those are not Council ships, Rel said. It was not quite a question. No, I said, they are not. He looked at me. There was no contempt in his expression now. There was something else. Something I recognized because I had felt it myself once, a long time ago, on a very different day. It was the look of someone realizing that they had badly, fundamentally, completely misread a situation. Ambassador Morrow, he said. His voice was careful now, very careful. What exactly are you doing? Negotiating, I said, properly this time. And in my ear, I could hear the sound of something that had been a long time coming. The quiet hum of a species finally speaking in a language the galaxy had never expected it to know. The wall panel in the annex was no longer showing just the ships. It was showing everything at once, a live cascade of feeds that had been routed directly into the Council's own broadcast infrastructure. Admiral Torres had arranged that detail specifically, not so I could watch, so the entire station could. Feed 1, the outer arc of the Council station, where 342 ships hung in a formation so precise it looked designed rather than assembled. They were every size the UN's shipyards had ever launched. Some were heavy cruisers, long and angular, built for endurance. Some were smaller escort craft that moved in slow, coordinated patterns between the larger vessels. At the very center of the formation, one ship sat completely still. I knew that ship. I knew the name it did not have painted on its hull because it was never meant to be visible. Torres called it the Patience, which was not its official designation but was, she had told me, accurate. Feed 2, a surface. Red-brown soil under a sky the color of a bruise. Figures moving through open terrain in coordinated teams, efficient and unhurried, reaching barriers and dismantling them with practiced hands. The Valori liberation, ongoing and now complete in the outer settlements. These were human special operations personnel. They had been embedded in the Valori resistance for 18 months. The Council had classified the Valori situation as a managed containment, a phrase that meant the people were being slowly squeezed out of their own world in exchange for resource agreements with the dominant regional species. Earth had found out about it 14 months ago through intelligence networks the Council did not know existed. Then Earth had done something about it quietly, without announcing it, without asking permission. Feed 3, a string of data, cascading text that scrolled across the bottom of the panel. This was the Council's own internal defense network, currently being accessed by people who were not supposed to be able to access it. The cyber warfare team had not closed the systems down. They had simply opened the doors and left them open, so that every command node in the Council's defense apparatus could see exactly how thoroughly it had been mapped. No weapons had been activated. No systems had been disrupted. It was a demonstration, not an attack. The message it communicated was precise. We were inside before you knew we were looking. Feed 4 was the one I watched the most closely. It was a long-range visual of a Council border checkpoint at the edge of what was designated restricted space near the Morkai frontier. 3 human vessels sat parked beside the checkpoint in an arrangement that could not be an accident. They were positioned with the checkpoint between them and open space, not in an aggressive stance but in a waiting one. The checkpoint crew was visible on the lower half of the feed. They had stopped what they were doing. They were looking at the ships. The ships were looking at them. Nothing moved. Everything communicated. Back in the annex, Davin Rel had not sat back down. He stood at the head of the table with both pairs of upper limbs pressed flat against his sides, which I had learned was a high-tension posture for his species. The legal officer had moved back against the wall. The 2 aides were very still. "This is not within the bounds of diplomatic protocol," Rel said. "You are correct," I said. "It is within the bounds of a different kind of protocol entirely." His eyes moved back to the wall panel, to the ships, to the Valori feed, to the data cascade. "How long?" he said, then stopped. He looked at me. "How long have you been planning this?" "Which part?" I said. He had no answer for that. I moved around the table slowly. Not toward him, I kept distance. I kept my posture open, nothing that could read as a physical challenge. I moved toward the wall panel itself and stood in front of it, looking at the feeds. "The first fleet," I said, "is the one your index found during assessment. 214 vessels, registered with the Undefense Registry, easily detectable, exactly where your survey teams expected them to be." Rel said nothing. "The second fleet," I said, "is the one you are looking at now. 128 vessels, assembled and crewed over the past 4 years inside asteroid belt infrastructure your survey never flagged as active. They went undetected because your index only looked at what it expected to find." I paused. The data cascade on the panel kept scrolling. "The third fleet," I said, "is not human." I heard the legal officer make a small sound. I turned to look at Rel. 14 species have been sitting in your dependent tier for decades, some of them for over a century. They have been sending non-binding advisory opinions into a room where no one reads them. They have been told to wait for reviews that almost never result in anything. And in all that time, not one of them has had someone sit down beside them and say, "What do you actually need? What do you have? What could we build together?" Rel's expression had shifted. The practiced smoothness was still there, but underneath it something else was moving, a kind of calculation I recognized. He was rearranging his understanding of what this situation was. "We sat down beside them," I said. "We spent 3 years doing it quietly, carefully, and honestly. We asked what they needed. We shared what we had. We did not ask for anything in return except one agreement. If we ever had to stand in a room like this one, they would stand with us." I looked back at the panel. The third fleet is crewed by 6 species. None of them are in the Council's top tier. All of them are species your index wrote off. Rel moved. He crossed to the communication panel on the far wall and placed his hand against it. It lit up, or rather, it tried to. The amber indicator on the legal officer's device pulsed once. The panel in front of Rel remained active, but the outgoing transmission signal sat at 0. He turned to look at me slowly. "They are not jammed," I said. "They are redirected. Anything you send right now goes into a buffer. It will release cleanly once this conversation reaches a conclusion. I want this to be a conversation, Davin. I want it to end with an agreement. I do not want it to end any other way. But that is your decision, and I am giving you the room to make it." There was a long silence, the longest I had experienced since arriving at this station. Rel looked at the panel. He looked at me. He looked at the wall of feeds, the patient ships, the liberated settlement, the open data network, the waiting Third Fleet crewed by species his council had spent decades managing. "What," he said very carefully, "do you want?" I reached into my jacket and removed a document. It was 12 pages. It was printed in 22 languages, English included, and it had already been reviewed by legal teams representing 8 species. I set it on the table between us. "A restructured council," I said, "binding protections for dependent tier civilizations, an actual review process with enforceable timelines, resource agreements renegotiated under fair market terms rather than stewardship leverage, and a seat at the table, a real one with a real vote, for every species currently in the dependent tier." Rel looked at the document. He did not touch it yet. "And if I refuse?" he said. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said something I had rehearsed, because I had known this question was coming. "Then we stay exactly where we are," I said. "The ships stay where they are. The systems stay open. The broadcast stays live. And every species in this station watches the Galactic Council try to figure out what to do with a Class II dependent that turned out to have 3 fleets, 6 allies, and an active liberation operation already concluded before the framework document was even printed." I let that sit for 3 seconds. Then I said, "Or you read the 12 pages." Rel looked at me. He looked at the document. He reached out and picked it up. And he began to read. In the feeds behind me, the Velori surface was clear and bright. Figures moved freely across open ground under that bruise-colored sky. Somewhere out there, Sergeant Rizakani, whose name I only knew from a mission file, whose face I had never seen, was drinking whatever passed for water on that world and watching the sky finally belong to the people who lived under it. I stood in the deliberation annex of the Galactic Council and waited while the man across from me began to understand that the universe had just changed. And I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired and grateful and very, very steady. Because we had not come here to win. We had come here to be heard. The difference was everything. The Grand Chamber looked different the second time. I noticed it the moment I walked back in. The same circular gallery, the same polished floor with its silver veining, the same haze where the ceiling disappeared into soft blue light. But the room had changed, not in shape, not in size, but in temperature. Some quality of the air had shifted. I had felt something like it once before, in a mediation session between 2 nations where someone had said the one true thing out loud for the first time, and the entire room had gone still with the weight of it. The council had reconvened in full session. All 17 species were present. The feeds from the external observation array were still live on the chamber's central display, the ship still in position, the Velori settlement still visible in the background of one feed, the data cascade still running. Primus Vale stood at his elevated platform, and even from the delegates' podium I could see the slight change in his posture. The practiced stillness was intact, but it was working harder than usual. I was not alone at the podium this time. Beside me stood a small device, a communication relay, authorized by Council protocol for multi-party diplomatic proceedings. Through it, 8 voices could join the session. 8 species currently in the Council's dependent tier, who had been waiting for this session since before I had even stepped into the chamber for the first time that morning. Davin Rel was in his usual seat in the Threx delegation arc. He had read all 12 pages. He had asked 11 questions. I had answered 10 of them directly and told him honestly I did not yet have the answer to the 11th. Then we had come back in here together. He had not said what he planned to do, but he had not called for a military response either. I took that as meaningful. "This session," Primus Vale said, "has moved into extraordinary status." His voice carried the same measured weight it always did, but there was something underneath it now, not quite uncertainty, because the Ethrin did not display uncertainty visibly, but something adjacent. A careful quality. The quality of someone who knows the terrain has shifted and is not yet sure by how much. Ambassador Morrow has submitted a counter-proposal under Council Charter Provision 7, which allows any delegate to formally introduce an alternative framework within the first deliberation window. The proposal is before this chamber now. The chamber's central display shifted. The external feeds reduced to a smaller frame in the lower corner. The 12-page document appeared in full, projected in the chamber's standard documentation format. Translated into all recognized council languages simultaneously. The gallery was very quiet. I looked at the Threx Arc. I looked at the Velhari. I looked at the Morkai, whose violet-reflecting eyes had not moved from me since I walked back in. Then I looked at the minor delegations, the species in the outer arcs who spoke less often and mattered more than anyone acknowledged. I had spent months studying which of them might be ready for a different arrangement. I had made quiet contact with 3 of them through back channels. No one had been watching, because no one had thought to watch channels running through a Class 2 dependent. The proposal, Vale continued, introduces significant structural changes to the Council's membership framework. The Chamber will hear the Ambassador's introduction before moving to deliberation. I stepped forward. I had prepared a speech. It was careful and measured and technically sound. I had practiced it. I had timed it. It was the right speech for a diplomat in a council chamber. I did not give it. Instead, I said, I want to tell you something that the civilizational index does not measure. The chamber waited. Every species in this room that has achieved full council standing has done so from a position of relative safety, I said. You developed your technologies, built your fleets, and expanded into space and environments that allowed for gradual progress. You made mistakes along the way, all species do, but your mistakes rarely threatened your total survival. I paused. Humans have never had that. Every generation of our history has lived with the possibility that the next generation would not exist. Disease, environmental collapse, wars that threatened to consume entire continents. We never once had the luxury of gradual. We had to be fast and adaptive and relentlessly creative because the alternative was gone. The gallery was still. I kept going. The index looked at that history and saw instability, I said. It saw a species that kept breaking its own civilizations and called that a weakness. But there is something else in that history, something you only see if you read past the conflict rate and look at what came after every single one of those breaks. We rebuilt. Every time. Faster than before. With something new that we had not had before the break. We are the only species in this chamber that has practiced rebuilding from nothing. Because we have done it more times than any index bothers to count. I looked at Vale. That is not a weakness, I said. That is a skill set, and it is one that a galactic community facing resource pressures, territorial disputes, and the long-term management of dozens of civilizations in different stages of development might find useful if it was willing to listen. In the Threx Arc, something moved. It was subtle. Davin Rel had shifted his posture very slightly, his upper limbs uncrossed. I had learned from a cultural briefing document written by someone much more patient than me that uncrossed upper limbs in a Threx deliberation posture meant active consideration. It was not agreement. It was the thing before agreement, the opening of a door. It was enough. I nodded toward the communication relay. I would like the chamber to hear from some others, I said. Vale looked at the relay. He looked at me. Protocol required him to allow it under the same provision that had gotten me this far. He gave a single slow nod. I activated the relay. The first voice was one I had not actually heard in person before. We had communicated only through written channels. It belonged to a Velhari named Tevel, who was listed in the Council's records as a Class 2 Dependent Zone Coordinator, which meant in practice that she was the closest thing the Velhari resistance had to a head of state. We have been in the dependent tier for 63 years, Tevel said. The translation rendering of her voice was smooth, but I could hear the edges of the original beneath it, something that sounded like wind across a long, open distance. In that time, we have submitted 47 advisory opinions on matters affecting our system. We have received formal acknowledgement of 11 of them. We have seen none of them acted on. A pause. Ambassador Morrow contacted us 2 years ago. In 2 years, we have accomplished more in terms of real resource exchange, technical development cooperation, and defensive capability than in the preceding 6 decades of Council stewardship. Silence in the chamber. A second voice joined, then a third, then 5 more, each one a different register, a different translation rendering, a different species speaking from the waiting end of a system that had asked them to be patient for decades. They were not angry. That was the thing I think the chamber had not expected. They were not giving testimony of grievance. They were giving testimony of what was possible when someone had actually worked alongside them. The Morkai delegate who had, in my observation, not moved in the entire session moved, just slightly, just the smallest realignment of posture, but I had been watching. In the Threx arc, 2 of the minor delegates had shifted away from Rel's position and toward the center of the arc. Not a declaration, just a repositioning. Then someone in the chamber spoke up, not from the main delegation arcs but from one of the outer positions. It was a species I had in my notes as the Duvari, small, quick, known for staying quiet in council sessions, but with the longest voting record of any of the outer species. Their delegate's voice, translated, was thin and precise. I would like to formally register interest in the restructuring proposal, the Duvari delegate said. Under Charter Provision 14, I am requesting a 30-day review window before any vote is called. Provision 14. I had included it in my briefing document because it was the provision that prevented any senior council member from calling an immediate dismissal vote. Provision 14 guaranteed 30 days, 30 days of formal review, 30 days of the feeds being live, the ships being present, the testimony being part of the permanent record. Vale knew what Provision 14 meant. I could see it in the way he held himself. I watched him think. I had spent a long time imagining this moment. What would the primus of a 400-year institution do when the institution's assumptions turned out to be wrong? Would he defend the system because it was his, or would he do the thing that was actually harder, look at it clearly? I did not know which answer I expected. I had prepared for both. Provision 14 is recognized, Vale said. From the Threx arc, not Rel, but the delegate beside him, a voice spoke for the first time in the session. The Threx delegation will also register review interest. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Then 3 more outer delegations registered interest in sequence. Vale looked at me from his platform. The practiced stillness was still there, but something in his eyes, a species-specific response I had read about but not witnessed before, a faint luminescence that ran along the edges of the etherian iris when something was being genuinely reconsidered, was active. He had started actually thinking. I stepped back from the podium. The relay continued to carry the quiet voices of the 8 dependent-tier species into the chamber. The external feeds still showed the ships, still in position, patient as stone. I thought about what I had said in the annex to Rel. We did not come here to win. We came here to be heard. But standing in that chamber, watching 4 centuries of assumption begin to loosen at the edges, I thought about something else. I thought about every human being who had ever done the harder thing, who had been in a room where the odds were wrong and the system was stacked and the most comfortable thing would have been to sign the document and go home, who had said, "No, not this. Something better is possible and I will not leave this room until we find it." I thought about that, and then I sat down and I waited. 30 days, we had 30 days. And we had already waited much longer than that. 1 year later, I am sitting in a building in Cape Town, South Africa, watching the ocean. The building is not large. It is an old converted office block that the undiplomatic corps requisitioned for the new Galactic Affairs Liaison Office, which did not exist as a formal body 12 months ago, and now has a staff of 217 people representing 31 nations and counting. My office is on the 4th floor. The window faces west. In the late afternoon, the light comes in flat and gold and sits on everything in the room like something that has been earned. I am writing the opening statement for the inaugural session of the Reformed Galactic Assembly. It is my statement. I have been asked to deliver it personally, which I was not expecting, and which I accepted because it would have been wrong to say no. The Reformed Galactic Assembly is not the Galactic Council. It has the same station, largely the same facilities, and many of the same member species. But it has a different structure. Binding protections for all member species, regardless of civilizational index tier. A real review process, enforceable, with set timelines, subject to third-party oversight. Resource agreements renegotiated according to terms that the dependent tier species had input on, rather than terms set from above. And a vote, a real vote with real weight for every species in the assembly. It took 11 months. It was not clean. There were weeks when I thought the whole thing would collapse under the weight of competing interests. There were 3 separate attempts to introduce procedural blocks that would have reset the 30-day window. The Threx block fragmented twice and reconstituted once in a different shape. Vale himself went through what I can only describe as a long and visible process of rethinking, not dramatic, nothing the Ethrin would show dramatically, but steady. He called me once on a private channel just to ask questions. Not to negotiate, just to ask. What is the history of X? What did humans learn from Y? How did your species resolve the tension between Z and Z? I answered every question honestly. When I did not know the answer, I said so. When the answer was complicated, I said that too. On the 63rd day of the review period, Vale submitted a formal personal endorsement of the restructuring proposal. His coalition followed within a week. Davin Rel retired from active council service. He is not gone from public life. His species does not really do retirement in the way humans understand it, but he is no longer the lead delegate. His successor is a younger Threx named Averin, who asked to meet with me privately on her first day in the role and spent 2 hours asking me about human history. Specifically, she wanted to know about the moments when things changed. The turning points, the before and after. I talked for a long time. She listened for all of it. Sergeant Rizakani, whose name I finally got right when he sent me a message 6 months ago, is now the first human military liaison embedded with the Velori Self-Defense Force. Not as a commander, not as a conqueror, but as an instructor and a partner. His last message to me was 3 lines. The work is good. They are fast learners. The sky here is a color that has no name in English yet, but I am working on it. I wrote back 1 line, you have time. Admiral Torres took her fleet back to non-visible status 2 days after the review period began. Not because the situation was resolved. It was not yet, but because the presence of the ships was making the smaller delegations nervous, and making the smaller delegations nervous was not helping the thing I was trying to build. Torres disagreed with that call. She told me so directly, which I respected. Then she pulled the ships back anyway, which I respected more. She is currently overseeing the construction of the 4th Fleet, not to threaten anyone, because the galaxy is large and complicated, and the Reformed Assembly has a mutual defense provision that we intend to mean something. The 4th Fleet is partly crewed by the same 6 species that crewed the 3rd. They are adding 2 more. The selection process, Torres told me last week, is going extremely well and is also the most complicated logistical project in human history, and she wanted credit for that in writing. I put it in this statement. The civilizational index has been replaced. In its place, the Assembly uses what we called, in the proposal document, the resilience quotient, a metric that measures not raw power or technological uniformity, but the capacity of a civilization to endure disruption, adapt to new conditions, and bring other civilizations with it through difficulty rather than around them. It is not a perfect metric. I do not believe a perfect metric exists, but it is a more honest one. It asks the right questions. Under the resilience quotient, Earth's score is one of the highest in the Assembly's current membership. The Velhari delegation formally submitted a gift last month. It was a small object, a piece of the first barrier their people had torn down on their own surface, the one from the feed that played in the deliberation annex while Rel was reading the 12-page document. It arrived in a sealed case with a note written in Velhari script and English both. The English translation read, "From the people who know what it means to have someone sit beside them." It is on my desk. It is sitting beside the window where the gold light finds it every afternoon. I have one more thing to finish before I close this statement. It is something I was not going to include because it is personal, and because statements for inaugural assembly sessions are not usually personal things. But I decided it belongs here because the people in that assembly chamber need to hear it, all of them, every species, the ones who were always at the table, and the ones who have only just been given a real chair. 12 months ago I was standing alone in the grand chamber of a body that had decided Earth was weak. I had a communicator in my pocket, and a fleet I had not yet revealed, and allies no one knew about, and a 12-page document that I had helped write over 2 years of quiet work with people across 14 systems. All of that was real. All of that was necessary. I am not saying any of it was wrong to prepare, wrong to use, or wrong to reveal in the way we revealed it. But none of it was the thing that actually changed the room. The thing that changed the room was the moment I asked Vale a question and let the silence after his answer do the work. It was the moment Tevel's voice came through the relay and said 63 years in 3 words, and the chamber went quiet. It was the moment the Duvari delegate, who had been sitting in those outer arcs for decades, sending quiet votes into sessions where no one expected the outer arcs to matter, spoke up, and registered Provision 14, and opened a door that all the ships in all the fleets I could have assembled would not have opened by themselves. The thing that changed the room was being heard. Not being feared. Not being formidable, though we were formidable and I will not pretend otherwise. Not being right, even though I believe we were right. Being heard. Being seen. Being taken seriously enough for the room to actually stop and think. That is the lesson I am taking to the reformed Galactic Assembly tomorrow morning. Not that humanity is the strongest. Not that force makes a point better than words. But that a species willing to sit down beside the ones the system has forgotten, willing to ask what they need and listen to the answer, and then do something about it, that species changes things. The galaxy needed a lesson. We gave it one. Not the lesson most people would expect from the species that showed up with 3 fleets and 6 allies, and a liberation operation already completed. The lesson that strength, in the end, is not what you carry into the room. It is what you build there, together, one voice at a time until the room is finally big enough for all of them. I close my laptop. I look at the piece of Velhari barrier on my desk. I look at the gold light on the water. Tomorrow the assembly begins. Outside my window, the ocean is doing what oceans do. It is moving and breathing and going on regardless, exactly as it always has. I find that reassuring. Some things continue, and some things, the right things if you do the work, finally change. I button my jacket. I pick up my bag. I walk out of the office and down the stairs and out into an evening that smells like salt water and the beginning of something that does not have a name yet. But we have time. We have always known what to do with time. We survived long enough to learn.